The screams echoed through the fog-shrouded streets of London's East End as another woman died in childbirth. But these weren't cries of natural labor gone wrong. In the squalid tenements of Victorian England, 3 sisters had built a thriving business around the most heinous betrayal of trust imaginable. Margaret, Sarah, and Annie Carroway called themselves midwives, but they were actually serial killers who used their medical knowledge to murder mothers and sell their babies to the highest bidder. For over 2 decades, they operated what became known as the Death House, a place where desperate women came seeking help and found only horror. This is the macabre true story of history's most evil midwives who turned the miracle of birth into a nightmare of murder and profit. The Carroway sisters emerged from the desperate poverty of Victorian London's East End, where survival often required abandoning every moral principle society claimed to value. Born in the 1840s to an alcoholic father and a mother who died in childbirth, Margaret, Sarah, and Annie learned early that life was cheap, death was profitable, and helping people was less lucrative than exploiting their vulnerabilities. Margaret, the eldest, had worked as a washerwoman and occasional prostitute before discovering her talent for assisting with difficult births. In an era when medical care was expensive and often unavailable to the poor, women who possessed even rudimentary knowledge of childbirth could build thriving practices serving desperate mothers who had nowhere else to turn. Margaret's initial foray into midwifery may have been legitimate, but it quickly evolved into something far more sinister. The transformation began when Margaret realized that unwanted pregnancies represented a business opportunity that conventional midwifery couldn't fully exploit. Victorian society's strict moral codes meant that unmarried mothers, adulterous wives, and prostitutes faced complete social ruin if their pregnancies became public knowledge. These women would pay almost anything to make their problems disappear, creating a market for services that went far beyond traditional birth assistance. Sarah and Annie joined their sister's practice around 1865, bringing complementary skills. That turned a small operation into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Sarah had worked in a workhouse infirmary, giving her knowledge of basic medical procedures and access to drugs and instruments. Annie possessed the psychological manipulation skills necessary to gain victims' trust while identifying their vulnerabilities. And financial resources. The sisters established their headquarters in a 3-story tenement building in Whitechapel, an area already notorious for poverty, crime, and violence. The building's basement was converted into an operating theater where the sisters performed their grisly work, while the upper floors housed victims during their recovery period. Neighbors learned not to investigate the sounds coming from the Carroway house, partly from fear and partly because the sisters were generous with bribes to ensure local silence. Their methodology was both sophisticated and horrific, combining genuine medical knowledge with systematic exploitation of their victims' desperation. Women seeking their services were carefully evaluated not just for their medical needs, but for their financial resources, social connections, and likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. The sisters developed different service packages, depending on what they believed each victim could afford and what level of risk her disappearance might create. For wealthy clients seeking discreet termination of unwanted pregnancies, the sisters provided relatively quick deaths using methods that appeared to be complications from miscarriage or difficult labor. These victims usually died within hours of arriving at the death house, allowing the sisters to maintain plausible deniability while collecting substantial fees from families grateful for the apparent discretion. Middle class women typically received what the sisters called extended care, involving weeks of deliberate medical mismanagement designed to slowly drain both the victim's finances and her health. These women would be told their pregnancies were experiencing complications, requiring expensive treatments and extended stays at the facility. By the time they died, their families had usually been bankrupted by the mounting bills the poor received. The most horrific treatment of all, as the sisters saw them as sources of both immediate profit and renewable inventory. These women were often kept alive for months while being systematically abused. Forced to serve as wet nurses for babies the sisters were preparing to sell, and used for medical experiments that helped the sisters refine their techniques for future victims. The baby selling operation was perhaps the most lucrative aspect of their business, as Victorian society's demand for adoptable infants far exceeded the legitimate supply. Wealthy families who couldn't have children naturally were willing to pay enormous sums for healthy babies, especially if the transactions could be conducted discreetly enough to maintain the fiction that the children were their biological offspring. The sisters became expert at timing murders to maximize the value of harvested infants. They would keep pregnant victims alive until the babies could be safely delivered, then kill the mothers to eliminate witnesses, while selling the children to pre-arranged buyers. This process was refined to industrial efficiency, with the sisters maintaining detailed records of customer preferences, pricing structures, and delivery schedules. Margaret specialized in the actual murders, developing techniques that mimicked natural childbirth complications while ensuring quick and relatively quiet deaths. Her methods included induced hemorrhaging, strategic use of drugs to cause heart failure, and manual strangulation disguised as attempts to clear breathing passages. She became so skilled at these techniques that even experienced doctors who examined the bodies rarely suspected foul play. Sarah handled the business operations, managing customer relationships, financial arrangements, and the complex logistics of maintaining multiple simultaneous victims while coordinating baby deliveries to buyers. She developed an extensive network of contacts throughout London's criminal underworld, including corrupt officials who provided false documentation and cemetery workers who helped dispose of bodies. Annie served as the public face of the operation, using her natural charm and apparent maternal instincts to gain victims' trust while gathering intelligence about their backgrounds and resources. She was expert at identifying which victims were likely to be reported missing and which could disappear without generating dangerous attention from authorities. The psychological manipulation employed by the sisters was as sophisticated as their medical techniques. They created an atmosphere of maternal care and professional competence that convinced victims they were in safe hands even as they were being systematically exploited and prepared for murder. Victims often remained grateful to their killers until the moment of death, believing the sisters were doing everything possible to help them through difficult situations. The death house operated with impunity for over 20 years, partly because its victims were drawn from society's most vulnerable populations. Unmarried mothers, prostitutes, and women engaged in extramarital affairs were unlikely to report problems to authorities, while their families often preferred to believe official stories about deaths from natural complications rather than investigating circumstances that might reveal embarrassing secrets. Local authorities were either bribed, intimidated, or simply overwhelmed by the scale of poverty and violence in the East End to investigate the sisters' activities effectively. The few officials who showed interest in unusual patterns of maternal mortality around the caraway practice were quickly discouraged through a combination of political pressure and physical threats. The sisters' downfall began in 1887 when they made the mistake of targeting Emma Whitfield, the daughter of a middle-class merchant who possessed both the resources and determination to investigate his daughter's suspicious death. Unlike their typical victims, Emma had maintained contact with family members who became concerned when her letters stopped arriving and began asking uncomfortable questions about her supposed medical complications. Whitfield's investigation uncovered evidence of financial irregularities in the sisters' billing practices, leading to broader scrutiny of their operations by authorities who had previously ignored complaints about the death house. The discovery of multiple graves in the building's basement, along with detailed records of baby sales and victim profiles, provided overwhelming evidence of the scope of their crimes. The trial that followed became a sensation throughout Britain, as details of the sisters' methodology shocked even a society accustomed to tales of urban crime and poverty. The prosecution presented evidence suggesting the sisters had murdered at least 600 women over their 2-decade career, though the actual number was likely much higher given the incomplete nature of their records and the tendency of some victims to simply disappear without documentation. Margaret, Sarah, and Annie Caraway were executed on December 3, 1888, becoming the last women hanged together in British history. Their deaths marked the end of one of the most systematic and prolonged killing sprees in criminal history, but their legacy lived on in the increased regulation of midwifery practices and greater attention to the vulnerability of women in desperate circumstances. The Caraway case exposed the dark side of Victorian society's treatment of women, particularly those who found themselves pregnant outside socially acceptable circumstances. The sisters' ability to operate undetected for so long revealed how society's moral judgments created vulnerable populations that predators could exploit with minimal risk of discovery or punishment. Modern criminal psychologists recognized the Caraway sisters as early examples of what would later be termed angels of death, medical professionals who used their positions of trust to murder patients while maintaining facades of caring competence. Their sophisticated organizational structure and long-term operational success anticipated the methods that would be employed by later medical serial killers. The death house building was demolished shortly after the sisters' execution, but its location in Whitechapel became part of the area's reputation for violence and horror that would be reinforced by the Jack the Ripper murders that began just months after the Caraway trial concluded. Some historians suggest that the climate of fear created by the sisters' activities may have contributed to the atmosphere that allowed the Ripper to operate with such apparent impunity. Archaeological investigation of the former death house site in the 1960s uncovered additional evidence supporting the scope of the sisters' crimes, including infant remains and medical instruments that confirmed contemporary accounts of their activities. The physical evidence suggested that the sisters had been even more prolific killers than the trial had revealed, with some estimates placing their victim count well over 1,000 individuals. The Caraway sister's story serves as a permanent reminder of how positions of trust can be exploited by those without moral constraints, and how society's most vulnerable members often become victims of predators who understand their desperation. Their crimes were enabled by a social system that criminalized and stigmatized female sexuality, while providing no legitimate support for women facing unwanted pregnancies. In the end, Margaret, Sarah, and Annie Caraway achieved a form of immortality, through infamy their names becoming synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of medical trust. They proved that evil could flourish in the guise of help, that monsters could wear the faces of healers, and that society's moral judgments often created the very conditions that allowed predators to thrive, the midwives to the damned left behind. A legacy written in blood, a reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from obvious threats, but from those who promise help while planning murder. Their death house may be gone, but the warning remains: beware of those who profit from others' desperation, for they may be angels of death disguised as angels of mercy.